Hi, this is a basic glaze demonstration using Amaco opalescent liquid glazes, which is low fire, lead-free glaze. The first thing that you are going to need to make sure before you start to glaze is that your piece has been bisque fired. So these are two pieces one has been bisque fired and the one on the left has not been bisque fired. You can see that there's a slight difference in color. If you cannot tell by the color if a piece has been fired or not, you can also tap it lightly with a paintbrush. And if it has been fired, it will sound like glass. And if it hasn't, it will just sound like you're tapping wood or a countertop. So you want to make sure that the piece has been bisque fired before you start. The next thing you're going to do is select your color. You'll want to look at the name of the color on the side of the glaze container, and that should be a pretty good description. Keep in mind that the glaze will change color when the chemical reaction takes place in the kiln and it has been fired. So the turquoise will show up much brighter than it looks in the bottle. Now, because glaze is made out of a suspension of sand and chemicals, the sand will tend to settle, and you want to make sure that your chemical mixture is as equal as possible before you start to apply the glaze. So you want to make sure that the lid is on securely, and then you are going to shake it. Next, remove the lid. If the lid is sticking, a tip is that you can turn the container onto its side and run the lid part underneath water. Since glaze is water soluble, it will loosen up the dried glaze and will make it a lot easier to loosen up the lid. Now you want to check and make sure that the consistency of your glaze is the right type of consistency. It should be like a thick buttermilk. It should not be super watery. It should not be super clumpy. It should coat your brush and be able to be spread pretty easily. So if it is not the right consistency, if it's too thick, sometimes you can just add some water. Sometimes some water and clear glaze needs to be added. But the best thing to do is just check with your teacher, and they should be able to give you some advice as to whether or not the glaze is still usable or not. So when I start to apply my glaze, I'm going to need to keep track of the coats that I am putting onto the glaze. The Amaco opalescent liquid glazes needs to have 3 coats. You can use 3 coats of the same color. If you want to do a layering technique, you could change the colors in between coats. I'm going to start at one side of my pot, and I'm going to make nice, solid, even coats in one direction. And you may need to reload or reapply the glaze to your brush several times. So I'm just working in a horizontal type fashion from left to right for my first coat. That should only take a few seconds to dry. And then I'm going to apply the glaze in a vertical linear type fashion. So this first coat is dry, and now I'm going to go to apply the second coat, and now I'm working in a vertical linear fashion. I'm painting from the top down to the other side, so we're just working perpendicular to the first direction that our brush strokes were. So that was my second coat. I'm going to give that a few seconds to dry, and then I'm going to work in a diagonal linear fashion for the third coat, just to make sure that I'm getting a nice even coat onto this pot. So just working from the top left towards the bottom right. Okay, there we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and glaze the outside of the pot, and again, working in different directions. One of the things you can do with the wheel thrown piece is, if you choose to, you could glaze the bottom of the pot and we can put it on stilts, or you can leave the bottom just the bare raw clay, and we do not need to glaze it. So I'm just gonna leave that bottom empty, and I'm gonna start to make my brush strokes around the outside of the pot. So now I've done the first coat, and I'm going to give that a few seconds to dry, and then I'm going to change directions and work from the bottom to the top in a vertical linear pattern, since my first coat was around the outside in a horizontal type pattern. And you just want to make sure that you are getting down into all of the cracks and crevices. If your pot has any type of texture carved into it, you want to make sure that the glaze is going all the way down into those cracks and crevices. One of the ways to ensure that is you can dip your brush into water a little bit and use that to help thin the glaze so that it will get down into your texture in your pot, especially if you have a lot of texture. If it's smooth, you shouldn't really need to do that, but if you have a lot of textures, that could be beneficial. So that's the second coat, and I'm going to go ahead and let that dry for a few seconds. I'm now going to add my third coat of glaze. And I'm just working in a diagonal type fashion again. Now, an important thing to know is that if you end up getting the glaze anywhere that you do not intend to get it on the pot, you can just use a wet rag or sponge to remove the glaze from the area of the piece that you don't want the glaze to be in. So I'm just going to take a wet sponge, and if you look closely, you can see that there's a little bit of glaze in an area where it should not be, and I just want this whole bottom of this pot to not be glazed. So I'm just going to use this wet sponge. I'm going to go along the bottom of that pot just to make sure that there's no glaze on there. And then this is ready to be fired. So you can put it on the shelf that says ready to be glaze fired, and that is a basics on glazing.